The clock on the wall of room 314 read 11:47 p.m. when Emma Rodriguez quietly slipped inside, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished floor. The familiar hum of medical equipment greeted her like an old friend, a symphony she had grown accustomed to over the past 18 months. In the center of the room, beneath the gentle glow of monitoring lights, lay Julian Cross. Emma paused at the doorway, as she always did, taking in the sight of the man who had unknowingly become the center of her world. Well, Julian Cross, the 32-year-old tech billionaire whose innovative software had revolutionized how people connected across the globe, now lay motionless in a hospital bed. His dark hair, once perfectly styled for board meetings and magazine covers, fell softly across his forehead. Even in his unconscious state, his features held a quiet strength that had captivated Emma from the very first night. She had been assigned to his care. The accident had made headlines across the country. Julian Cross, founder and CEO of Crosstech Industries, had been driving home from a charity gala when a drunk driver ran a red light. Impact had been devastating, leaving Julian in a deep coma, with doctors uncertain if he would ever wake up. His company's stock had plummeted, rival firms circled like vultures, and the media speculated endlessly about his condition. But here in room 314, away from the chaos of the outside world, there was only peace. Emma approached his bedside with practiced quiet, checking his vitals with gentle efficiency. His breathing was steady, his heart rate normal. She adjusted his blanket, ensuring he was comfortable, then pulled the chair closer to his bed. This was her favorite part of the night shift, the quiet hours when she could sit with Julian and pretend, just for a while, that they were simply two people sharing a moment together. She opened the book she had brought, a collection of poetry by Pablo Neruda. Emma had discovered Julian's love for literature while going through his personal effects that first week. His apartment, according to the nurse who had retrieved some items for him, was filled with books of poetry and classic novels. It had surprised everyone who knew the tech mogul only through his public persona, but it had made perfect sense to Emma. There was something in his peaceful expression that spoke of depth and sensitivity. As she began to read softly, Emma found herself studying Julian's face in the gentle lamplight. She had memorized every line, every shadow, the small scar above his left eyebrow from what she imagined was a childhood adventure, the way his lips curved slightly, as if he were on the verge of smiling even in sleep. She had often wondered what his voice sounded like, what his laugh might be like, what it would feel like to have those closed eyes open and look at her with recognition and warmth. The rational part of Emma's mind knew how impossible her feelings were. She was a nurse from a working-class family in Queens who had put herself through nursing school while working 2 jobs. Julian was a billionaire who lived in a world of private jets and penthouse apartments. Even if he were to wake up, what could there possibly be between them? But in the quiet darkness of room 314, rational thoughts seemed to fade away. As the night wore on, Emma found herself doing what she had done every night for months. She set the book aside and moved her chair even closer to his bed, dropped to barely above a whisper as she began to talk to him about her day, her hopes, her dreams. She told him about the difficult patient in room 302 who had finally smiled today, about the coffee shop owner who always asked about her patient, about the sunset she had watched from the hospital roof during her break, and then, as she did, every single night before her shift ended, Emma reached out and gently took Julian's hand in hers. His skin was warm, his fingers long and elegant even in unconsciousness. She held his hand tenderly and spoke the words that had become her nightly prayer, her secret confession to the sleeping billionaire who had stolen her heart without ever knowing she existed. Emma's fingers traced gentle patterns on Julian's palm as she settled into what had become their nightly ritual. The hospital corridor outside was quiet except for the occasional footsteps of the security guard making his rounds. These were her most precious hours, and she could speak freely to the man who had become her closest confidant, despite never having heard his voice. She told him about growing up in Queens, the youngest of 4 children in a family where every dollar was stretched to its limit. Her mother had worked double shifts as a housekeeper while her father drove a taxi, both sacrificing everything so their children could have better lives. Emma had always dreamed of becoming a doctor, but nursing school was what the family could afford. She had never regretted the choice, especially not since meeting Julian. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who had grown up counting pennies, was now caring for a man whose net worth was discussed in billions. She had read about him in the business magazines that visitors sometimes left behind. Julian Cross had built his empire from nothing, a brilliant programmer who had dropped out of MIT to start his company in a garage. Success story was the American dream realized. Yet Emma sensed a loneliness in him that all his wealth couldn't cure. She had learned about his life through overheard conversations between doctors and the occasional visit from his business associates. Julian had no family, his parents having died in a car accident when he was in college. He had never married, though the gossip magazines linked him to various socialites and actresses. But Emma had noticed something telling in his personal effects. Among his expensive watches and designer clothes, there were books of love poems, handwritten journal entries about longing and connection, and a single photo of him volunteering at a children's hospital the previous Christmas. The public Julian Cross was all business and success. But the private Julian, the one Emma was getting to know through these quiet nights, was a man who yearned for genuine human connection. As the weeks had turned to months, Emma found herself sharing more intimate details of her life with his sleeping form. She told him about her failed engagement to Marcus, a fellow nurse who had ultimately decided she was too serious about her work. She confessed her fears about never finding love, about spending her life caring for others while remaining alone. Herself shared her secret dream of traveling to Italy, of seeing the art and architecture she had only admired in books, on particularly difficult nights. When she had lost a patient or faced a family's grief, she would rest her forehead against Julian's hand and find comfort in his steady breathing. He had become her anchor, her source of peace, in a job that could be emotionally overwhelming. She knew it was unprofessional, knew that her supervisor would be concerned if she knew how personally invested Emma had become in Julian's care, but she couldn't help herself. The connection she felt was undeniable, even if it was one-sided. She had started bringing him small gifts, things that violated no hospital policies but added warmth to his sterile room. Fresh flowers that she replaced weekly, usually white roses or lavender, scents she hoped might somehow reach him. She had convinced the day shift nurses to let her create a playlist of classical music and jazz that played softly during visiting hours. She even brought in a small plant, a peace lily that she tended carefully, telling Julian it would bloom. When he was ready to wake up, her most treasured ritual came at the end of each shift, just before dawn began to lighten the windows. She would take both of his hands in hers and speak directly to his peaceful face, imagining that somehow, somewhere in the depths of his unconscious mind, he could hear her words and know that he was loved. She told him about the way his presence had changed her life, how caring for him had taught her about devotion and hope. She confessed that she had never felt this way about anyone before, this deep connection that transcended physical attraction or shared experiences. She loved his quiet strength, the gentleness she sensed in his unconscious form, the vulnerability that his public persona never revealed. Sometimes she would trace the outline of his features with her eyes, memorizing every detail. She wondered what color his eyes were, what his smile would look like, how his voice would sound when he spoke her name. These fantasies felt dangerous and wonderful, a secret garden of possibility that bloomed in the darkness of room 314. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came subtle changes that only Emma noticed. Julian's sleep seemed less deep somehow, his breathing occasionally shifting in rhythm, as if he were dreaming more vividly. She mentioned it to Dr. Patterson during morning report, but the neurologist remained cautiously pessimistic. 18 months was a long time, and while miracles did happen, they were rare. Emma refused to let medical statistics diminish her hope. If anything, she felt more connected to Julian than ever. She had started reading him passages from travel guides about Italy, describing the rolling hills of Tuscany and the romantic canals of Venice. She painted word pictures of all the places she dreamed of visiting, imagining that somehow her dreams might call to him, might give him a reason to return to the world of the waking. It was during one of these quiet travel narratives that she first noticed it, a slight flutter of his eyelids, so brief she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But then it happened again, and this time she was certain. Her heart began to race as she leaned closer, studying his face intently. She was in the middle of describing the sunset over the Mediterranean when Julian's fingers moved. Not the involuntary muscle spasms that sometimes occurred, but a deliberate flexing, as if he were trying to grasp something. Emma caught her breath, her hand instinctively reaching for his. The moment their skin touched, Julian's eyes opened. They were the most beautiful shade of deep brown Emma had ever seen, warm like chocolate with flecks of gold that caught the morning light streaming through the window. For several heartbeats, they simply stared at each other, the moment stretching between them like a bridge spanning 18 months of one-sided conversation. Julian's lips moved, and though no sound emerged at first, Emma could read the word. He was trying to form her name. She pressed the call button for the medical team while never breaking eye contact with Julian. His gaze was alert and focused, not the confused or disoriented look she had expected. There was recognition in his eyes, and something else that made her pulse quicken. Warmth, affection, as if he were seeing someone he had been waiting for. When Dr. Patterson and the nursing team arrived, Emma reluctantly stepped back to give them room to examine Julian. But his eyes followed her movement, and when she started to leave the room, he made a sound of distress that stopped her in her tracks. She returned to his side immediately, taking his hand in hers. His fingers squeezed hers with surprising strength, and his lips curved into the faintest smile. It was then that Julian spoke his first words in 18 months.
Please.
His voice rough from disuse, but unmistakably warm. He whispered her name again, this time audibly, and then added words that made Emma's world tilt on its axis. I heard you. Every word, every night.
How?
The medical team was amazed by Julian's rapid responses to their tests. His cognitive function appeared intact, his memory sharp, but Emma barely heard their excited discussions about his remarkable recovery. She was lost in the wonder of finally hearing Julian's voice, of seeing intelligence and warmth in eyes that had been closed for so long. When the doctors finally left them alone to run additional tests, Julian turned his full attention to Emma. Speaking was still an effort, but he seemed determined to use what strength he had to talk with her. He told her about floating in darkness, about hearing her voice like a lifeline calling him back to consciousness. He remembered her stories about her family, her dreams of Italy, even the poetry she had read to him. He had been aware, trapped in his own body, but sustained by her presence. Her caring, her love. As the day progressed and Julian's strength slowly returned, their conversation deepened. He asked her about herself, wanting to hear her voice now, that he could respond. They talked about books and music, about dreams and fears, about all the things she had shared with him during his unconscious state, but now with the joy of actual dialogue, the connection Emma had felt for so long was reflected, back to her now, multiplied by the reality of Julian's warm responses and growing smiles. When he thanked her for staying with him, for never giving up, his eyes filled with tears that matched her own. As evening approached and Emma's shift neared its end, Julian caught her hand as she prepared to leave for the first time in 18 months. He looked directly into her eyes and spoke words that would forever change both their lives. Julian's recovery progressed at a pace that amazed the medical staff, but Emma knew the true catalyst for his rapid improvement was their growing connection. Each day brought longer conversations, shared laughter, and moments of intimacy that made her heart race with both joy and uncertainty. The billionaire tech mogul and the night shift nurse were falling in love, but the obstacles seemed insurmountable. During his physical therapy sessions, Emma often stayed to assist, helping Julian regain his strength and mobility. These sessions became precious opportunities for them to be close, her hands guiding his movements, steadying him when he grew tired. The simple touches necessary for his care sent electricity through both of them. When their eyes would meet during these moments, the air between them crackled with unspoken desire. Julian had been awake for 2 weeks when he first kissed her. It happened during an evening thunderstorm, the kind that knocked out power across the city. The hospital's emergency generators had kicked in, but room 314 was dimly lit by soft backup lighting. Emma was adjusting his pillows when Julian caught her wrist. Gently pulling her closer, she could see the question in his eyes, with a careful respect for her choice, even as his desire was obvious. In response, she leaned down and met his lips with hers. The kiss was tender at first, tentative, then deeper, as 18 months of one-sided longing finally found expression. When they broke apart, both were breathless, and Julian whispered against her lips that he had dreamed of that moment during his unconscious state, but their growing love existed in a bubble that couldn't last forever. Julian's business associates had been circling like sharks during his coma, and his awakening brought a parade of lawyers, executives, and accountants to his bedside. Emma watched as the man she had come to know, gentle and vulnerable, transformed into the commanding presence that had built a business empire. The contrast was jarring, but not unappealing. Seeing Julian in his element, confidently handling decisions from his hospital bed, only made Emma more aware of the vast gulf between their worlds. He spoke casually about stock options and international acquisitions, while she worried about her student loan payments and her mother's medical bills. The reality of their situation became unavoidable when Julian's attorney, Richard Blackwood, arrived with a team of advisors. Emma was checking Julian's vitals when the expensive suits filled the room, their conversation immediately turning to sensitive business matters. Blackwood glanced pointedly at Emma, and Julian understood the unspoken message. For the first time since awakening, Julian asked Emma to leave the room. The dismissal, though gentle, cut through her like a blade. She was a nurse, staff, not someone who belonged in discussions about Julian's empire. The reminder of her place in his world was both humbling and heartbreaking. That evening, when they were alone again, Julian tried to bridge the gap that had opened between them. He took her hands in his, apologizing for the afternoon's awkwardness, but Emma could see the conflict in his eyes. He loved her, she was certain of that, but he was also beginning to understand the complications their relationship would bring. The complications became more apparent when Julian's recovery reached the point where he could be transferred to a private rehabilitation facility. The move would mean the end of their nightly conversations, the end of the intimate bubble they had created in room 314. More significantly, it would mean the end of Emma's role in his daily care. On their last night together in the hospital, Julian and Emma made love for the first time. It was beautiful and desperate, a claiming of each other before the world could pull them apart. Emma had worked the night shift again, specifically to be with him, and in the pre-dawn darkness, they gave themselves to each other completely. Julian's touch was reverent, as if he were memorizing every inch of her skin, told her she was beautiful, that she had saved him in every way a person could be saved. Emma had never felt so desired or so loved, but even in the height of passion, she couldn't shake the feeling that this might also be goodbye. Afterward, as she lay in his arms in the narrow hospital bed, Julian spoke of his plans for them. He wanted her to come with him to his penthouse apartment, to be part of his life as he fully recovered. But even as he painted pictures of their future together, Emma could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He was a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his business empire, but love was proving to be far more complicated than any corporate merger. The next morning brought the harsh light of reality. Julian was discharged to a private rehabilitation center in Manhattan, a place where Emma had no reason to visit. As she watched him leave, surrounded by his team of advisors and medical professionals, Emma felt the familiar ache of loving someone she could never truly have. 3 weeks passed without contact between Emma and Julian. She tried to convince herself that their hospital romance had been nothing more than a beautiful dream. She threw herself into work, caring for other patients with the same dedication she had shown Julian, but the nights felt empty without their conversations. She had returned to her small apartment in Queens, to her ordinary life, but everything felt different now that she knew what love could be. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, Emma returned home from her shift to find a black sedan waiting outside her building. The driver handed her an envelope with her name written in Julian's distinctive handwriting. Inside was a simple message. "Meet me on the hospital roof, where we used to watch sunsets. I have something to show you." Emma's heart raced as she made her way back to Metropolitan Hospital. The roof access was technically off-limits to staff after hours, but Emma had a key from her many nighttime breaks during Julian's care. She pushed open the heavy door to find the rooftop transformed. Hundreds of tiny lights had been strung across the space, creating a canopy of stars against the city skyline. Rose petals formed a path leading to where Julian stood waiting. No longer the hospital patient she had cared for, but fully himself again, strong and confident in an expensive suit. Yet when he smiled at her, she saw the same warmth and vulnerability that had captured her heart during those quiet nights in room 314. Julian crossed to her, taking her hands in his with the same gentle reverence he had shown in the hospital. He told her that the weeks apart had been tortured, that he had tried to convince himself their love was just a product of extraordinary circumstances. But he couldn't deny what he felt. Every business meeting, every step in his recovery, had felt meaningless without her. He had spent the time apart not just recovering physically, but preparing for this moment. He had quietly investigated Emma's background, not to judge her, but to understand the barriers she felt between them. He had learned about her family's financial struggles, her student loans, her mother's medical bills, and he had taken action. Julian reached into his jacket and withdrew a folder of documents. Inside were the paid-off notices for Emma's student loans, a receipt for her mother's medical expenses, and a deed to a house in her parents' neighborhood, purchased anonymously and gifted to her family. Emma stared at the papers in shock, overwhelmed by his generosity, but also confused about what it meant. Julian saw her uncertainty and quickly explained. He wasn't trying to buy her love or create an obligation. He was trying to level the playing field, to remove the practical barriers that might keep them apart. He wanted her to choose him for love alone, not because she needed his financial help, and not despite it either. Then Julian did something that took Emma's breath away. He dropped to one knee on the hospital rooftop, pulling out a ring that caught the light from the hundreds of bulbs overhead. It wasn't the massive diamond she might have expected a billionaire to offer, but something far more personal. The ring held a single perfect pearl, surrounded by small diamonds arranged like stars. Julian explained that he had the ring custom-made, inspired by something Emma had told him during one of their hospital conversations. She had mentioned that her grandmother's pearl necklace was her most treasured possession, a symbol of love. That lasted a lifetime. The diamonds represented all the nights she had sat by his bedside, each one a star that had guided him back to consciousness. His proposal was simple and heartfelt. He told her that she had saved his life in every way possible, that she had taught him what love really meant. He wanted to spend the rest of his life loving her the way she had loved him during his darkest time, completely and without reservation. Emma's answer came through tears of joy as she said yes, falling into his arms as he stood and spun her around among the lights and rose petals. They kissed deeply, a kiss that sealed their future together and erased all the barriers that had seemed so insurmountable. The months that followed brought challenges as they blended their different worlds. But their love proved stronger than any obstacle. Julian insisted that Emma continue her nursing career if she chose, supporting her dream of returning to school to become a nurse practitioner. Emma brought warmth and genuine connection to Julian's previously isolated existence, helping him find meaning beyond business success. Their wedding took place a year later. Not in a grand ballroom, but in the children's ward of Metropolitan Hospital, surrounded by the patients and staff who had become their extended family. Emma wore her grandmother's pearls with her wedding dress. Julian's vows brought tears to everyone present as he credited his bride with teaching him that love was the greatest fortune of all. As they began their married life, Emma and Julian often returned to room 314, now converted back to a regular patient room. They would stand in the doorway, remembering the miracle that had brought them together. Julian had awakened from his coma to find not just his life returned to him, but the love that would define the rest of his days. And Emma had discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in whispers in the dark, with faith that love can conquer even the deepest sleep. Their story became legend at the hospital, proof that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest awakenings happen not when we open our eyes, but when we open our hearts.